This is Two Hands Philosophy, in which my friends and I discuss philosophical topics to learn from each other and from our readings. This week we discuss 3 papers from the Cambridge Companion to the Philosophy of Biology, published in 2008 and edited by David Hall and Michael Roos. These were Gene by Paul Griffiths and Karola Stotz, Information in Biology by Peter Godfrey Smith, and Units and Levels of Selection by Elizabeth Lloyd. Today again I'll be speaking with my good friend Theral Timpson. So how's it going, Theral?
It's good. It's good.
I'm glad we're able to... Go ahead.
Well, it's been a full week in the United States.
Speaking of weeks, I'm glad that we're able to keep to our weekly schedule, even though the last one was a month ago. Discipline begins with aspiration, even if it sometimes stays there. But we'll do more than aspire in actually getting this project going. I'm very optimistic. I'm really enjoying what we're doing.
Cool, me too. And I've had some great response.
Oh, really? I saw that we had a few hundred views. I expected it to be like 20.
Based on just the title?
No, it's just based on my knowing about 20 people. Okay.
Oh, what do you know about 20 people?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Here, I thought I was getting geared up for a dissertation on 20 people.
Oh, no. So I'm glad that we're okay. So I'm glad that we're taking our own advice, or rather Dennett's advice, which we reviewed previously.
Oh, okay.
That,
I got an alarm going off.
What's the alarm?
That I'm doing anything that Dennis said to do.
Oh, no, you'll like this. I mean, it was basically that to approach philosophy, one ought to begin with some secondary discipline. I don't know if he specifically called out some scientific discipline, but it's just as well. Your own secondary discipline to your interest in philosophy would be, of course, biology, or more specifically, genetics. And so that's where we've begun.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a podcast on genetics. We're starting our 14th season next month. I've just been prepping for it. So I kind of ran into that. Incidentally, I did not study biology in college, but I've worked in the field and had, got to know a lot of scientists and have been very fascinated by it. Some call this the century of biology. And, the NIH likes to say that. Is that just a marketing slogan or is it real?
I don't know, honestly. I think it might be real. I mean, it's of all the sciences, certainly biology seems to be competitive, or to be competed only with the information technology, if that's a science at all. Uh, and having said that, I think it's interesting then that we are discussing the um, the the intersection of genetics and information.
Yeah. No, this is great for us. I'm super happy to start with biology. And you are a what do you call yourself? A software engineer?
Yes, of course. A software engineer with by avocation, um, or rather by vocation. Which is it? Vocation is what you do for a living, but in Latin, it's actually your calling. So this is what's complicated, right? I prefer to say that that philosophy is my calling, and then my profession would be my avocation. But of course, that's the one they pay me for. It's very complicated. I prefer not to think about it very much.
Right,
Uh,
but you have deep background in
oh
data science
yes,
and tech.
not
And
data science, not data science, because that's a specific area of technology. But it's interesting you should say so, right? Because in English, we refer to the field as computer science, and the profession, or at least the most obvious profession that flows from computer science, as software engineering. The word software has a kind of peculiar origin. It's just a play on hardware. But
Mhm.
but in French and Spanish, they don't use the term computer science. Instead, they call it informatics. It's quite
Huh.
plainly put as the study of information, and I think that's interesting. I certainly think of computer science as the study of information processing, or you might say the study of the technology of information. That's how I like to think of it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think these things can inform our views. I'm not saying it totally informs or totally limits our view, but you and I were part of a philosophy group for a while, and after several months, I finally figured out that over half of the group was coders, and I was like, oh, okay.
Well, that's just an artifact of being in San Francisco. This is tech central. But does it inform? I'm not so sure. It's not so much that computer science informs my understanding of philosophy, let alone software, uh, than that it just happens to be something I know more about, which raises more questions. But it is as much as a source of deception and of misleading threads than of special insights. I mean, at some point I'd like to do a series of readings and commentary on the intersection, or at least the uh, the uh, the mutual dependencies between informatics and philosophy. But I'm happy to start with genetics since it is natural as opposed to artificial, and so
Hmm.
keeps us closer to science.
Hmm.
The very idea of information, that is the concept, is, as uh, Godfrey Smith points out, relatively new, or has not had very much play in the literature of philosophy for, I expect, historical reasons and unimportant historical reasons, mainly because other words have been used to capture and discuss the basic ideas. Words such as truth, representation, meaning, reference, and the like. Not to mention form, and even the idea, the concept of informing, that is the verb to inform, I think had some play in ancient philosophy. But in the 20th century, information has mostly mostly been missed by philosophy of language and mind, which is where it would most be applicable. That said, it isn't ignored, and it isn't entirely ignored. The philosophy of computer science, if there is such a thing, would certainly concern itself with information by way of information theory, Shannon's information theory, and more broadly, the study of, well, representation.
Oh, okay. I read Godfrey Smith a little bit differently. So this is the third paper of three papers we're going to discuss, right?
That's right.
We could say that. So Godfrey Smith wrote this paper on information as it has to do with biology. And I thought what he was saying is, well, actually, philosophers have been talking about information for a long time, even if biology hasn't. And so the conversation is already ongoing. and I thought he was just like inviting biologists to tap into that.
Oh, you're not wrong. I just, and he even says as much, that the concept as such, that is under the term of information, is relatively rare, but it is discussed under other terms. That was my only point.
Oh, okay. I see. Hey, before we move on from so we're talking about the interaction of tech and biology.
Mhm.
Um, one thing on the podcast, and I used to live in Silicon Valley, um, is there has been a tech-driven positivism as relates to biology. And I'm thinking of a paper by, I think it was Pandar Singh, um, put out an article saying, why hasn't biology progressed more? And now that us engineers are here and have showed up, we're going to take care of all this drug development.
Why do you call
And
it a positivism?
well, the tone of his article was, look what we've done in engineering. We've solved every problem in the world. All we need to do is just bring our tools over to biology and help you guys out. Okay, this is
Oh, I
sounding
see.
this is sounding a bit edgy on my part, but I guess I've felt that
No,
way.
I understand what you mean. You mean positivism as in scientific triumphalism?
Yeah, well, and also reductionism.
Yes,
I
of
mean, I
course.
think reductionism is the core of positivism.
I would agree.
And
I would,
you do technology, you do software. I think a lot of people's background, I mean, obviously you study philosophy, but I think a lot of people's background in that area is physics and mathematics. And I think,
Mhm.
because we've done so well in physics and we've reduced chemistry to physics, that this leads to a kind of hubris. I would call it a hubris, because when it comes to biology, it hasn't really worked out that way.
Mm.
It's had some reductive success, but it's biology has stuck a wrench in the wheel of reductionism.
We will discuss reductionism and the the contrary emergentism or holism in future discussions. But until then, I find it interesting that you find hubris, as you put it, in reductionism, and I find it interesting, at least in part because our friend uh, Nanik advised to me that if I'm going to discuss biology in the context of philosophy, that I should maintain some measure of humility or modesty, seeing as to how I know relatively little in biology. And I thought that's very interesting. Why do we speak of modesty and humility in relation to those topics we know relatively little about? I responded to her that no doubt it's advisable to be well informed and to limit myself to what I believe myself to know, or at least when I don't know, to speak in the tone of questions rather than affirmations. But I don't see how
Mm.
humility or modesty is going to make me more knowledgeable. So I wonder if that's even the appropriate uh, attitude to have. I don't particularly care to be deferential, which is, I think, the more central idea in humility or the
Mm.
avoidance of
Okay, yeah, I was
hubris
just
and
going to ask you your
arrogance.
thoughts on humility.
Yes, well, like I said, I think humility is contrary to arrogance, where hubris is a specific kind of arrogance. And I think that that makes sense only when there is a relationship of deference. That is, there's someone or some authority to which we defer in our humility. In this case, that would, well, in the case of hubris, that would be the gods. Here we have no gods in the context. So it would be, I suppose, the the authorities, the epistemic authorities in biology. That is to say, philosophy ought to defer to the scientists. This returns to this returns us to a question I raised in the previous recording about deferentialism, something I'm inclined to reject. That isn't to say that I don't think the scientists know more about science than non-scientists do, of course. But I'm not really asking scientific questions. I'm asking philosophical questions. They
Hmm.
just happen to be about science. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure modesty or humility have any place.
Well, I totally get your point about deferentialism. I don't think that's a good thing, really. And one thing, we came out with a show on Mendel's Pod this week by someone who had worked in the military, worked in Israel Defense Forces,
Mm.
and got really good with AI and machine learning, using it for satellite images to look for adversaries. And then he retired and he wanted to do something big. And he ended up going into biology and doing a biology startup, um, applying the AI tech. Of course, AI is a hot thing right now for investors. But basically the machine learning technology that he had used and bringing it to pathology, because his dad had a biopsy for prostate cancer, and getting the results took 30 days. And this was the moment, he said, where he said, I think we could do something better. So I've talked to a lot of tech people who've come into biology, and that's what I love about their attitude is I think I think in a way they actually are not restricted by the same biases.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I mean, it's basically the entrepreneurial attitude. Uh, I don't know that I want to go into it right now, but maybe there is an entrepreneurial attitude toward philosophy, to be contrasted with a scholarly attitude. So
Hmm.
if the scholarly
Oh, I like
attitude,
that. Yeah.
yeah, let me elaborate on that. So if the scholarly attitude is a publication-oriented project or um, um, a, an orientation toward professing, that is, being an authority on some topic, either rising to the rank of being the authority or deferring to the authorities, whoever they may be, so that for any array of topics, someone can speak for them within the guild, together, of course, with some dialectic to advance the field over time. Then, as a result, you get libraries full of knowledge, for which I am eternally grateful. I learn from scholars more than from anyone else. But an
Mhm.
alternative to the scholarly approach, uh, what I'll coin the entrepreneurial approach by analogy with the entrepreneurial attitude to business and technology, is that it be more product oriented. In the case of technology, the product, of course, is anything you can take to market, whether it's a good or a service. But in the space of philosophy, the market isn't so obviously defined. We're not really buying or selling knowledge or ideas, or we ought not to be anyway, and I certainly don't want to engage in any such market. But there are products. And I think the product is how we become, to the extent that we become personally more knowledgeable, wiser in the relevant ways than we have, I think, produced. Now, this is, I think, interestingly different from the life of scholarship because you can be a very, productive. I mean, they have their products as well. Let us just say you can be a very successful scholar by by simply occupying some otherwise unoccupied space or niche in the logical space of possible positions by defending that position and being representative of that dialectical possibility. But it isn't going to make you necessarily wiser, unless, of course, that happens to be the true position. And more importantly, unless you make the effort to arrive at good positions to have on all the relevant questions of your life. But as being a good scholar requires specialization, especially in the, let's say, first half of your career, you'll at best be wise on a very narrow set of topics, maybe even just a handful set of questions, which will most likely be irrelevant to your personal life, or at least if they are relevant, it will be on very few occasions. A genuinely
You're
wise
saying
person,
philosophical questions might be irrelevant to your life?
no, not irrelevant, just minimally relevant. For example, suppose you take up, as we're going to discuss, I'm sure we'll get to it, right? If
At some
if you
point,
take
we'll
up the
talk
question,
biology. Yes.
yes, if you take up the question, what is
Look, you and I are still
information?
getting to know each other again after not seeing each
That's
other
right.
for a
That's
few
right.
years.
No, and that's the goal, right? The goal is to get to know each other. Um, but if we take up the question of what is information in the context of biology, and in particular the context of genomics, um, the the application will be limited to those who happen to be uh, professionals in the field, or yeah, because I mean, I can't think of any other application. I mean, I suppose you could employ your
Application of
wisdom.
biology?
No. Like application in your personal life to an understanding of the role of information in the mechanics of a gene.
Oh, uh-huh. I
You
mean,
see,
it could. It could. Someone,
well, I mean, it depends on
may
who
get a
you are.
genetic test and they may discover, they've got the gene for Huntington's disease or they have a BRCA gene or something like this. Um, but you know what? I think that was really well said on your part. Um,
Well,
Now
listen,
when you
there's more
talk
to it.
about scholars,
There's one more bit. There's one more bit.
okay,
Uh, there is, of course, a practical application to that wisdom, but it would be applicable by very few people. Even if you take a test to determine whether you have Huntington's or not, it will be enough to know that the relevant expert assures you that that test is a good indicator of whether you have Huntington's. How to understand the relationship between information and that particular gene in your particular body will be of minimal importance. On the other hand, if you happen to be somebody like yourself who is constantly negotiating conversations with a wide range of uh, experts in the field of genetics who may disagree with each other, but who all have something interesting to say, uh, who all have something interesting to say, you'll want to have a stronger purchase on the relationship between information and genetics, especially if you want to give an answer, a reasonable answer to the question, is this the century of biology or of information science? It may well be both, if information is at the heart of the biological sciences, especially in the case of genetics. So you see, it depends on the questions you ask. But my point is that a life of wisdom, that is, a life, as the ancients said, well lived because it's been examined, depends on answers to broader questions than the ones we're going to be discussing today, namely the questions of ethics, the questions of epistemology generally, how to negotiate the relationship between science and religion and politics, between the sexes, between state and individual, things like this. This is what actually makes a difference. And my experience, I mean, I'll give you a personal anecdote. So I once hung out with a bunch of professional philosophers. Um, uh, all my senior, I was basically a student or recent grad, actually, and uh, they were experts in epistemology and philosophy of language, especially. And I was very taken aback that during our time off, basically during lunch and during which we just talked about whatever, the question of the politics of abortion came up. This was, I mean, it hardly matters since abortion has been political for the last 50 years. But
Yeah, but really
basically,
fascinating questions. The whole question of
oh, I mean,
personhood.
yeah, and the philosophy of abortion is immense. In fact, I've often heard it said that one particular paper in the philosophy of abortion is the most widely read paper in all of analytic philosophy.
Oh wow.
Undoubtedly,
I'm
that's not because it's especially good, but rather because the question of abortion is especially interesting. So very many people who
oh,
don't read philosophy at all are reading this paper.
I'm writing this down. All right.
I'll find it for you
I
later
want
if
to
you like.
read what everybody else is reading. Something in me does that.
Well, maybe we can discuss this one. I'm sure I can tell you. I'm sure I can find out which one it is. It's probably the one that introduces the case of the violinist. Remind me about that later if you like. Anyway, the point is
By the
that
way,
when
this is
we,
not always true. I don't always look for numbers. In fact,
Mhm.
I find that when I'm watching YouTube and skipping around, if it's got a lot of views, I'm like, what's wrong here? Because I usually watch videos that have less than 1,000 views.
Oh, really? It's not all about the H index then, huh?
I mean, that's just the general correlation, you know.
Uh-huh. So what I found is that their conversation about abortion was distinctively unphilosophical. Basically, it was no more theoretically wise. Um, I don't even know that I should use the word theory there. Let us just say it was no more wise in any sense of the word, either the ancient or the modern sense of the word, than the conversations I might have about abortion with anybody. And so I thought, well, what is the point then of dedicating one's life to philosophy if one isn't all that much wiser on those topics one doesn't specialize in? And then it occurred to me, well, that's because what they're engaged in is not the love of wisdom, but rather the the profession of scholarship. Now, I don't want to argue. In fact, I want to argue against the idea that therefore philosophy has strayed from its original objective. I still think it's about the love of wisdom. I just think that what has happened is that philosophy has now separated itself uh, into producers and consumers, like any other market, and that the scholars are, for the most part, producers. They are generating the publications, the record of conversations, and generator and articulator of arguments that advance our understanding. And then the consumers are whoever just happens to be interested in becoming wiser. Of course, um, the consumers are most likely to be the very same producers to a greater or lesser extent. But I would just be one of those exceptions that is mostly a consumer and not a producer.
Well,
And
you
that's what
talk
I
about
take our
you keep
conversation.
yeah, you keep talking about scholarship.
Mhm.
How would
Well,
you compare scholarship to academic?
oh, well, um, I, what we mean by academic these days is just whatever the university is doing. And I take um, the brunt of what the university does as academics, with very few exceptions, like, well, the professional schools like law school or hotel management or that sort of thing. That's not, I think, especially academic, although although even then, for the most part, it would be academic. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. For the most part, I think they overlap. University sports, of course, would not be academic. Let's put it that way. Academic is basically the liberal arts and the sciences in the interest of research, and the production of research is the is the practice of scholarship. So they're very close.
Okay.
Scholarship, of course, just meaning of the schools, right? An academy just being the Greek name for Plato's school.
Oh, all right. That's a nice
Oh, did you know that?
bit of etymology. No, I did
Yeah.
not know that.
So a
Because
little
it
digression.
seems going back, I've
Mhm.
had this thought in my head for 5 minutes now. But going back when you compared the entrepreneur and the scholar,
Mhm.
um, and you were talking about authority.
Yes.
So one big question is, where does the academic or the scholar, where does the authority come from? I think with the entrepreneur, you were talking about products. There is that which feeds the entrepreneur, which is connecting with their audience and getting immediate response. Right? People buy their products. I think there
Mhm.
is an authority to customership. You know,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes.
when tests sell, like say
Mhm.
genetic tests, okay,
Right.
Huntington's disease tests or BRCA testing, there is a kind of truth to that.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And that's, that's how biology's kind of has progressed, really.
Right. Yeah. Let me try to incorporate what you've said into my story. So, I regard myself as more entrepreneurial than scholarly in my approach to philosophy, in that I'm
Hmm.
more interested in the personal product of becoming wise um, than in becoming productive in publications. That is, I'm less interested in contributing than in benefiting by what has been contributed. An
Hmm.
analogy here might be the difference between being a nutrition scientist and being well nourished.
Mm-hmm.
I want to
Sure.
be well nourished, uh, but that doesn't speak to the entrepreneurial aspect, since being an entrepreneur is more about production itself than consumption. So then, what might be the entrepreneurial approach to philosophy? I think it would be, like you said, or let's put it in the language of technology. It would be about creatively discovering some product to market fit. That is, figuring out what it is that a um, a wider audience or consumer base, but let's say audience because I think that might be appropriate in this context, discovering what some broader audience is in search of that might be satisfied by the wisdom that is attainable by the selective and intelligent consumption of the products of philosophical scholarship. And I think that's what I'd like to do, not only for myself, but for those with whom I discuss all of this, in particular now you.
Are we talking a sociology of philosophy
No, I wouldn't
or
go
the
so far as to
social
say
setting of philosophy?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that I want to study the social dynamics of how all of this occurs. I leave that to the sociologists. I just want to do it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do it.
Let's do it. So, what did we do? We read a sequence of essays, and let us begin with Griffiths. Paul Griffiths writes an essay called, I think it's just Gene or the Gene,
Hmm.
and and what he does is he recounts the history
Okay. So you're
of.
going to skip over the unit of selection paper and go to the gene
I want
paper.
to not skip, but rather reorder.
Reorder. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Uh, so uh, he recounts the history of the concept of the gene from the days of Mendel to I forget who he identifies with the most recent developments of the concept, but basically to the present day. And I find this to be both very informative from the perspective of a student of theoretical biology, but also informative of the nature of the development of concepts in the history of science. And in particular, the dynamics by which a concept can become more or less material versus more or less functional, or
Mm.
also
Yeah,
alternatively
that,
more or
yeah.
less nominal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the core tension here with the
Mhm.
gene. Is it the functional gene, you know, uh, which is a construct of biologists or philosophers of biology, or is it a material discrete thing that exists out there in the world? Or it's
Uh-huh.
both?
Well, okay. Um, does he speak of constructs exactly?
Uh-oh. I said the wrong word.
I mean, you're not wrong.
Our audience will find out that I tend to be more a social constructivist than you are not. Um,
Well, the question is what
and
Griffiths is.
that's I had that in my notes, but did I impute that? But okay, I mean, I can stick with just the functional gene. The functional gene. This is more the concept of the gene,
Well,
the
he does say
model
something
of the
similar
gene.
to construct. He does say something similar to construct, namely a what was it? It was like um an intervening variable. Do you remember that?
No,
Basically, a hypothetical entity, a posited entity,
hypothetical entity.
a
Okay.
posited kind. Yeah, I think all of these are somewhat interchangeable, provided one doesn't enter into the metaphysics or the philosophy of language.
Well, he
But
quotes historian Raphael Falk right at the beginning and
mhm,
said Raphael Falk has described the gene as a concept intention.
well, um, there is the concept of the gene, but then there is also the gene. So concepts are in the mind, genes are in the nuclei of cells. So
Hmm.
genes are not concepts, even if it is conceptual to speak of genes, but only because it's conceptual to speak at all.
Okay, so I don't think it's so easy as you just said. There's the concept, and then there's the gene in the nucleus of the cell. I think our understanding of what's going on in the nucleus of the cell is called a gene because that's the model we've used.
Model. So you think the concept of the gene depends on a model,
Yes.
whereas I think the model depends on the concept. So already we have some difficulty.
Well, I mean, isn't this the same question of the model of the atom, Bohr model of the atom?
Um, I mean, the same question can be asked. Does the concept of the atom depend on the model, or does the model depend on the concept? Sure. Considering the atom, uh, the concept of the atom goes to antiquity, and Bohr's model begins with Bohr, it would be difficult to argue that the concept depends on the model.
But yeah, I recognize basically this is the tension. This is what the paper's about.
Mm,
He traces the history and says in the beginning, with Mendel, for example, Mendel is imputing this concept of a gene. He doesn't even call it a gene. He's just talking about traits are discrete things that he notices, and it later becomes called a gene. But this is more in the concept direction. This is the functional gene. Um, but then when you get with Watson and Crick in 53,
mhm.
perhaps that could be
Before then,
seen.
really, right? Before then, there was another figure that anticipates the um, that it's a crystal
Oh
and
yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, I mean Rosalind Franklin was able to take those amazing pictures of the chromosome,
mhm,
right?
yes.
I mean, I mean, this is the power of NASA. Once you got pictures, it's definitely there.
Mhm.
um, no, there's a few in between, but I think Watson and Crick could be seen as the high age of the material gene.
Certainly, yes.
And then he argues that now we've gone back more toward the functional.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's
So
the
why?
basic outline of it.
Why? I mean, that's interesting. Why is it going back toward the functional? What does this mean about genetics?
Mhm,
Does it mean that it's not as determinative as we would have thought in 53?
mhm, mhm,
Again, is it turning out to be more like physics in the model of the atom, quantum
mhm.
physics, where it depends on the observer?
Wow. Okay. One issue at a time. Uh, did you see any mention of quantum mechanics in this paper? I
Yes.
don't think I did. You did? Hmm.
Well, I was watching a video on quantum mechanics at the time. Um, at the same time,
Uh,
I was reading this paper, so that might have.
yeah, I think that might have been what happened. No, there's no mention of quantum mechanics. I just checked. Uh,
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. So
but
I imputed all that. Good.
mhm.
This is the second time that
I don't know
you're
that there's any
finding that
mention
I'm
of.
imputing things on the paper.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's any imputing going on, even by the figures discussed in the paper. Additionally, I don't think that the question of determinism comes up either, although that question does come up in Godfrey Smith's article. So
Yeah,
we have
no,
to.
I'm not just quoting the paper. I'm just I'm just
Oh, we're
asking,
not just discussing the
these are the
paper.
big questions.
Well, I mean, are they the big questions or are they your big questions? The questions asked by Griffiths and discussed by Griffiths and Godfrey Smith are one thing. The questions that we bring to it are a second thing, especially if you bring them and I don't.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to tie this into an earlier paper about units of
It's not
selection,
there. It's not there either. There's no quantum
and
mechanics there,
and
and
then we're
there's no
going to get into the
determinism.
information thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, actually, I was hoping to do the gene, then information, then units of selection, but we can jump around. Uh,
okay, get me
so
back on track. Get me back on track. That's
yeah,
fine.
let's just focus. I think what's at stake here is more than anything the ontological question, uh, and secondarily the causal explanatory question. That is, what are genes? What are genes in relation to whatever else we have available to discuss in the context of biology? Most obviously, molecules and functions. And since nominalism is at play, the terminology itself. And secondarily, there is the question of um, of I think of realism. That is, to the extent that genes turn out not to be the material genes, then are they real at all, or some kind of useful fiction?
That's the question.
That's the second question, and the third question is, uh, um, is there anything to be said about what genes are definitively, or do we instead admit of a variety of concepts of genes? It is always tempting to adopt some kind of linguistic relativism by which we just multiply the meanings of words, obviating disagreements by interpreting one author as referencing, or rather, by interpreting one author as making use of one sense of the word and another author as using some other sense of the word. But that has its consequences, namely that, for instance, when we go on to discuss the other two papers, the one on information and the one on units of selection, it becomes ambiguous what it is that they're talking about when they speak of genes without that differentiation. So it's not obvious that we gain anything from abandoning the 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 univocality of the concept. So we can
Yeah,
begin with
yeah.
we can
I,
we
I
can
I mean, this is kind of a history, right? It's just a
it's
history.
more than a history. I mean, it's a history of a debate. And the debate has a purpose, namely to be resolved, to find answers to questions. And we can participate in that debate and not merely be historians or bystanders.
But he doesn't make any arguments.
That's
Uh,
not going to stop me. I mean, but I think he does anyway. I think he does.
except, what you include is definitely your argument. I mean, I think every paper makes an argument in a way. If, for instance, the last line of the paper,
I think it's explicit. He's explicitly arguing.
he's arguing, I think, for the functional side. And also he's arguing for attention that has been unresolved. Yeah, you just said, it's unresolved.
No. To say that it's been unresolved is not to argue for how to resolve the tension. It's merely to present a historical narrative. I think he's doing more than that. He is presenting the historical narrative, but then he also, in his conclusion, so called, offers us a conclusive thesis, namely that that the return to the functional sense is appropriate.
So what do you make of that? What do you make of that? I mean,
Well,
you and I have a long history of talking about nominalism, and here it is, right in front of us. You know,
mhm.
the last line of the paper is something like genes are what has been accepted by scientists. That sounds like the nominal gene to me. And it
Well,
takes us into the nominalism debate.
I'm not sure that that's what that last sentence is. What I'll read it out loud so
Okay.
we can get in context. It says, finally, it's possible to think of genes as simply those sequences whose similarity on various dimensions to stereotypical genes has led them to be annotated as genes and whose annotation as such has been accepted by the scientific community. So he's saying it's possible to think of genes in that way, but
And in
not
parentheses,
that.
he has nominal genes there, right there at the
Well,
last.
yes, yes, of course. That's to be contrasted with post-genomic molecular genes. That's the previous one. And the neoclassical and classical molecular conception of the gene. So there's three different conceptions. And I think what he wants to say is that they all have their role. They all have uh, some some purpose depending on what area of the science one is focusing on, but that the tension is resolvable in that they are relatable to one another. And I think that's how he resolves the debate.
Say that again.
So,
The tension. What?
um, okay, let's talk about what the three ways of conceiving of the gene are first, and then let me try to revisit what I've just said. So the first is the neoclassical or classical molecular conception of the gene, and the idea here is to identify genes by the specific sequences of nucleotides that have some particular features, such as their um, the I'll need some help from you because my understanding of genetics is relatively weak, but
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's sequences that tend to be copied as a whole, or that when recombination occurs, the splicing occurs between these specific sequences, that they have certain features such as the what I might call the starting codon and the ending codon and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, the
Yeah.
problem, of course, is that these genes will typically not correspond to a single enzyme or a single peptide chain, a single peptide chain, um, but rather combine with other genes or perhaps be expressed in a variety of distinct uh, proteins, such as might be the case with an intron, right? I think that's the basic idea. In other words, it could be one to many, it could be many to one, and although there may be cases of one to one expression, at the very least, that's not universally true. And this causes problems because depending on what it is that you're theorizing about, you'll want to focus on one or the other end of the gene and gene expression relation. So if you're interested in particular for example, the mechanics of cell division or of the recombinant, what is the process called by which the sperm and the egg come together?
Mitosis.
Mitosis. So um, that process, a theory of that process will, I think, want to employ the neoclassical or classical molecular conception of the gene, because it is in those terms that one would speak of the kinds of uh, processes that take place and which ones don't take place. Uh, the expression, or rather the regulation of a gene, that is, whether it is expressed or not, will speak of specifically the molecular conception, since what's being regulated is the expression of specific sequences, whether an mRNA basically translates it or not. Is that right?
Yeah. So my take on this part is that the neoclassical genetics was the genetics that evolved in the first part of the 20th century, and it was based on Mendelian genetics. That's the
Oh no,
functional
no,
part.
no, 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 no.
And
That's
then you have the molecular gene in 1950s,
mhm,
okay, where we find the actual genetic material.
mhm.
And it's a constant back and forth because we're looking for material uh, to match the thinking of genetics that we had done since Mendel. Okay.
Okay.
And
So
so
the
then they
neoclassical.
actually find the material gene. It's so many bases long. It may have an intron. It may,
Mhm.
whatever. It's the beginning codon, um, and um, but it doesn't always match sort of the functional part.
Mhm. So
Okay.
maybe I have the terminology wrong. Are you telling me that the neoclassical one and the classical molecular ones are distinct? I was taking them to be the same.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking neoclassical genetics was that before the molecular gene.
Okay, okay. So there was a point earlier in the paper where two different terms are said to be interchangeable, and one of them was the classical molecular, but I've forgotten what the other one is. At any rate, I take the classical one to be the Mendelian one, which is functional, and the molecular one to be roughly the one inspired by the Francis and Crick discovery of the material that the material substrate for genes. And then the neoclassical, presumably, you're now telling me is the the functional one that evolved from the eventual rejection of the one-to-one model of gene to protein.
Right, or even further on to phenotype. So
Or
that
to
was
the
my
phenotype.
understanding.
Right.
Look, I have not heard of neoclassical and classical versions of genes in my
That's fine.
history and
It doesn't
past.
matter.
I think the important part is just comparing the functional to the material.
That's right. And to the nominal. So, but mainly the functional to the material. That's right. So let's just call them that for ourselves, so that we don't have to review exactly how it is that Griffiths is putting this together. So my basic view of this is that depending on what one is studying in biology, one will want to employ either the material conception or the functional conception, and that so I just described a case, those areas in which one would want to employ the the molecular, or let's say the material conception, and then it is in the study of evolutionary biology uh, that is relating traits to phenotypes to environments to the hypothetical germline properties that we would want to speak of a functional gene, where that functional gene would have its material basis on not one sequence, but a number of sequences, uh, and perhaps other complications having to do with transposition and the like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And so,
yeah.
so the question,
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
so the question
I'm
is
thinking
there?
big picture here already. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know why.
Go.
So am I. So the question is there any reason to suppose that there is a tension to be resolved necessarily? I think what Griffiths is arguing is that whereas it may be that for historical reasons the concept of the gene has attached itself primarily either to the material or to the functional conception, both both have their place, and that the presumption that there ought to be only a single idea that is employed in models of both the the molecular mechanics and also the evolutionary dynamics depends on the assumption of the one-to-one gene trait relation, which turns out now not to be true.
Right. Right. So if I can just zoom out a bit,
Mhm.
I do think it's the nominal debate, but I think it's at the core of science, the scientific endeavor. I mean, isn't this the same thing as early scientists naming family, kingdom, species, or individual organisms? Naming tree, naming zebrafish. There are these things we observe in the world. And in the case of Mendel, he actually imputed that, certain things must be there because he didn't have a sequencer, right? And then we started sequencing all this DNA. And yes, what he had imputed, the functional gene was there, but it starts to go this way, starts to go that way, Griffiths, and he has a co-author too, by the way. By the mid 1960s, he says a lot of scientists thought that the major problems of molecular genetics have been solved, and they were inclined to leave it, to others to iron out the details. And then immediately it got much more complex with gene-to-gene interaction, with epigenetics, where the environment can turn on and off a gene. And so once it goes in steps. Once you have a little bit of a visual or understanding of the material, then it gives you new directions to go with the functional.
Yeah, the larger question regarding nominalism is definitely in play. But you know what? It's interesting. What I'm inclined to ask is an even larger question, which is, why is it that the slightest remove from an obvious categorization on the basis of simple material traits provokes the turn to nominalism? Let me first explain what I mean
A
by that.
variation from a category by the material. That's what you said?
No, let me elaborate. So the the categories, the material categories of relevance here would be molecular types. There's only so many different nucleotides, so many different amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
The combinations of them are a matter of combinatorics and very deterministically identifiable. And the interactions between them are a matter of biochemistry, chemistry, really. And as such, any categories uh, that are reducible, that is derivable from the categories of being one or another atom, one or another molecule, composition of atoms, would be material categories. Alternative.
It's interesting. Sorry, I'm going to do a little interruption, but please
Okay.
go back to this. And by the way, this is so much fun for me. I don't get to do this on my regular podcast, to talk about it at this level, uh, and we're getting right into it. So you just you just brought up the atom. Sometimes I wonder if we need to go to the level of the atom to do genetics right.
Well, that's
But
basically
anyway,
what I'm
continue.
asking. That's
Yeah,
what I'm asking.
that's
Right.
what you
So,
asked. Okay.
yeah, I mean, to answer yes to that question would be to insist on the material conception of the gene, right? Where we conceive of the gene as specific sequences of nucleotides.
Okay, now let me ask you a question about you. Uh, are you and I arguing for one of the other, functional or material? Are you arguing more for the material gene?
I'm arguing against nominalism, but in favor of a a an account that can accommodate both the material and functional conception on realist grounds.
Okay.
And this will become more apparent when we go to Godfrey Smith.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Um, yeah. So, but maybe just to wrap that up, um, what I'm seeing is it's stepwise. It's not this tension that exists between these two in a static environment. It's like you do more functional work, and that teaches you more what to look for. Then we go out and, these life science tools companies develop sequencers, and they develop spatial biology instruments. They develop new instruments. And that's what scientists absolutely love, because that drives their science forward. But because they've done the functional work, they know more what to look for this time around. And then they go in there with these new pictures and images and data collection. Um, and then they see actual material things, and then they come up with new functionality.
Yes.
Okay. Am I getting too
What,
excited?
well, I'm just not sure what follows from the way in which the work actually gets done.
Uh, okay. So I guess my point there is, the difference between just some static definition, functional material gene, and one that's more in process.
A
One drives
definition.
the other.
Are you talking about whether the definition itself is in progress or static?
Uh, I'm not so much worried about the definition.
Well,
Um,
you did say a static definition. Maybe you didn't mean that.
a static view, a static view. There's one over here on the left. There's one over here on the right.
A
Um,
static view. And
the
who has
two.
a static view? Who isn't changing his mind?
Oh, okay. So you don't see any kind of
I don't
static.
see anything static at all. I mean, we're studying dynamic processes. Everybody's changing his mind over time. There's nothing static. So I'm not sure what you're contrasting the the dynamics of life with.
Well, a lot of times when people talk about a tension between two ideas, um, it it can bring up the idea of a static, ongoing, eternal conflict,
I think
and
that's
that's
just
what I'm
empty
hitting
rhetoric.
against.
I think that's empty rhetoric. I don't know that. I think this is just a way of qualifying one's opposing what the views one opposes as being dogmatic. I don't think anything here is static, unless what you're making reference to is um, the the eternality of forms, which goes all the way back. Is that what you're talking about? I mean,
Maybe,
if
maybe
that's what it is, okay. If that's what it is, then oxygen certainly isn't changing its form in the course of the entire history of life. Surely you
true.
admit that that's static.
Yes, yes. So maybe I have some underlying, my own underlying tension. Thanks for teasing that out, because I thought reading this paper, I thought, hey, a gene is still a gene by any other name, to quote Shakespeare. Uh, you know,
Well, but
s-
the problem is we're not talking about genes uh, exactly. We're talking about the concept of genes. The concept of genes, that
mm,
is the mental representation of genes, changes because it is part of the history of science. And insofar as science is changing, then the concept is changing. I mean, take the example of physics, which is more obviously static in a number of ways. The concept of light has changed dramatically over the centuries, but light itself, what a photon is,
mm,
its maximum speed, its mass, all of that is constant and eternal, which is just another word for constant.
mhm.
Let us not confuse theory with what the theory is about. Genes, unlike light,
Well, that's not so easy to do,
I'm not saying it's easy, but to
right?
quote Kennedy, we do things because they are hard. So,
Ooh, you even had the Boston accent.
I did spend some time there. The the uh, the the difficulty is that in the case of genes, um, whereas the concept changes over time, just as the concept of light changes over time, genes themselves may change over time because life, of course, is not itself eternal. There was a time before there was anything that was alive, and the specific mechanics of the relations between DNA, RNA, ribosomes, proteins, and everything else changes. And in fact, we can see early samples of, or rather, samples of what might have been earlier stages in the prokaryotic life and bacterial life in particular, which is very different, right? So, for all I know, I mean, I don't know enough biology to say, but for all I know, there are some archaea or bacteria that don't even have uh, tRNA or or mRNA. I don't know. But the point is that, or maybe they don't even have the same four nucleotides. Like maybe it's two or three or different ones. I'm sure it's the same for all mammals, but that's not definitive of life. What's definitive of life, if there is such a thing as an eternal definitiveness of life, would be something abstracted from any particular chemistry. And frankly, I'm not sure I've ever read anything that suggests there's any consensus on what might be the the perfectly static reality of life. Let's get to that some other time. I just wanted to press the point that we need to be very sure before we advocate for a more dynamic conception that what we are contrasting that conception to is not itself also dynamic. Having said that,
Yeah.
I do agree with
So
you.
so let me respond to that.
Okay.
Uh, it's tricky. You look at the material thing, even the term material is a term. So what is the difference between that thing, that material thing, and our theories?
Well, our theories are the kinds of things that we find in books, or at least representations of the theories are in books. They are otherwise in our minds. But the material thing is what we find in the bodies of the organisms that we study. It's like the difference between a word and whatever the word refers to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought of Putnam's famous talk on semantics here, which this takes us into the information paper, but where he his illustration of water and saying that meaning ain't, and water and twatter, right? That meaning ain't just in the head.
That's a separate issue.
Well, oh, I think that's exactly it. There is some of it that's in the head, and there is some of it that's outside of the head.
Yeah, but I wasn't talking about the meaning. I was talking about the word, which is certainly in the head or nearby, in the case of speech and writing, and the referent, and the referent, which in this
I
case
do
would be.
appreciate your dry
It's only
understatement.
dry if no one laughs. And the referent, which is the water itself, twin or otherwise. Meaning is this controversial midway reality or hypothetical or
Hmm.
hypothesized reality between the referent and the word, and that is an interesting topic, and we can talk about
Okay,
that
all right,
someday.
that's fine.
But the primary relation I'm talking about here doesn't make reference to meanings at all. It's just the word and the object that the word refers to. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the material would be the actual atoms, and the theory would be the kind of thing that gets taught in the classroom. We're not teaching atoms in the classroom. We're teaching theories about atoms. Or yet another way to think about the difference is that if there were an aboutness relation, the theory is on the left-hand side and the matter is on the right-hand side. The theory is about the matter. It isn't the matter that is about the theory.
That's a good point.
Okay.
That's a good point. Um,
So then, so
yeah.
then I think so. Material is in antiquity, in particular, opposed mainly to the formal, to form, right? Matter as opposed to form,
Mm-hmm.
and but more recently, the material or the physical or the real is um, is opposed to the nominal, and I think the reason is because nominalism is a rejection of forms.
Okay. It's a rejection because I was just going to ask, what's the difference between the
Mhm.
nominal and the formal?
Uh, well, the formal is the real if nominalism is false.
Why is
So,
nominalism false?
no, I said if.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, but I mean,
So
when
if
you
the
say
nominal,
if,
Mhm.
then I can
Oh, why
ask.
is nominalism false? Because realism is true. I mean, that just happens to be my view. I mean, yours is more likely to be nominalism. So we'll review all of
Well,
this over.
I wrote a piece today about the
Mm.
gene because we've been reading about it, and I have to say it's this very discussion which challenged my realism the most. out of anything in
Mm,
my life because I thought that genes were real.
I
And the
see.
more I've done a genetics podcast, the more I think it's a form.
Very well. Okay, but then you also want to say that forms are not real. Otherwise, there's no
Okay, no,
contradiction there
I
at
would
all.
say forms are real, but
Oh,
I'm getting away from the idea of matter, material
but which is it then?
materialism.
Which is it then? You said that you thought genes were real, but to then say now you think instead that they are form. Well, if forms are real, then how is that an evolution in your thinking? It
Okay,
sounds
so
like a
you're good
refine.
with
Is it a refine?
formalism.
Is it a refinement or a change of mind?
Well, I can't as easily separate formalism from nominalism that you can.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, we'll get to it. Let me just say one more thing to finish the thought regarding the different conceptions of the gene. So the molecular or material conception of gene is opposed to the functional one. The functional one then will be, uh, at the very least, not material. But then the question is whether it is real, and that will depend on whether it is formal and there are forms, or there aren't. In which case, it's at best nominal. And this will turn ultimately on two questions. One is the ontological status, which is just another way of asking, is it real or not, and what kind of real? The ontological status of biological functions. That's one question that it turns on. And the other is the ontological status of information. Now, we didn't read on biological function, but we did read on information. However, we should talk briefly about biological function because Griffiths does. So let me just briefly say, and by the way, I think talk of biological function is implicit in the information paper anyway. In fact, I think he explicitly does talk about function. It's just not front and center.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just talk about all of them. So if the gene is a function, or whatever it is that realizes a function, then uh, then the gene for say green eyes would be whatever processes and materials, presumably some sequence or sequences of nucleotides, together with various regulatory mechanisms, various cascades of enzymes, and so on, that result, at least in normal cases, that is, where there isn't some dysfunction, in the phenotypical trait of green eyes. Especially if this is a terrible case now because I don't know that there's any selective pressure for green eyes, but especially were there some selective pressure for green, or at the very least, let's say, light colored eyes. I think there might be some selective pressure for light colored eyes, if not any particular shade. And so, to the extent that that selective pressure can itself be functionally understood, then the mechanisms that correspond in some informational sense of correspondence to the selective pressure that is the relation between the environment and the phenotype would constitute the gene, especially at the level of the chromosomes.
Oh, so this is sort of your functional definition. The a
That's my
selective.
understanding of what it is to be a biological function. Yeah, I mean, I could say
Okay.
more, but
Mm-hmm.
at the very least, the point is that there is a materiality to it, though it is not exhausted by the materials involved.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so treading water here that I'm not sure a
That's all right.
material thing is not a function.
No, of course not. No, no.
I'm not
Um,
sure that that would be the case.
what? You're not sure that what would be the case?
That or wouldn't be the case that a material thing could be a function.
No, I don't think that it is. I don't think that it is. I'm
I'm
saying
surprised
that
you don't want to go into quantum physics here. As if quantum physics was a different universe, but we need to be in the universe of the gene.
I'm just trying to stay on topic. I mean, I think quantum mechanics is fascinating, but so is. So is electoral politics.
Okay, I don't see electoral politics as being
I don't see quantum mechanics.
informative here on the discussion, like I do the fact, that we had our classical version of physics and we thought it was a material thing, and then we came into quantum physics and we realized that it was observer dependent.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, let me just briefly speak to that since you did tie it to materiality. First of all, it is not obvious, or at any rate, a given, that the introduction of quantum mechanics renders physicality observer dependent. Only the Copenhagen interpretation, to my understanding, has that conclusion, and the the philosophers of physics I most pay attention to today have ruled the Copenhagen interpretation dead, basically. I don't know exactly.
That's why you don't want to get into this, because you don't
No,
think.
that's not the only reason. I have
So
two.
we have to do this on some program.
Sure. Yeah.
I do see now why you think it's separate, because you actually question what I understand as quantum physics. You actually question that, and so you
Let's write
don't
down
think
what we're
it's
going to
that
consider.
informative.
Let's write down what we're going to talk about in the future, because we've already discussed three things and I want to make sure I don't forget them. There's Copenhagen. Um, what else?
Electoral
Nominalism.
politics.
Nominalism, electoral politics, and we can talk about politics itself, but also the philosophy of politics. I think is very
Yeah,
interesting.
look, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh, you're only kidding? Oh, we can talk about the philosophy of common law. That's real. Okay. And then, and what else was it that you mentioned? There was one other. Oh,
Um,
well,
well, no, I think that's what we've mentioned.
good enough for now. There was one more, but I just forgot.
I'm totally giddy about getting into the information paper. It's
Yeah,
like
let's.
stepping into a river barefoot, because we're now fully onto metaphor, my friend. Your
Oh,
ultimate
yes,
enemy.
metaphor. I want to write that down because we definitely have to. Okay. All right.
Your ultimate enemy.
Well, no, I disagree. I think
You even nailed
you.
me in our first session, and you
Mhm.
said, "Will you agree that the rest of this podcast, we can take things literally?" And
Oh.
I did. This has been your idea, but that's the thing I felt the most miserable
All
about
right. All
the
right.
week after.
All right. Sorry to piss on the poet, but that's just something one has to do, being an acolyte of Plato. Let me just okay. Let me finish the thoughts on Griffiths. So basically, uh, if we admit to the potentially real ontological status of biological function, and to theory that can relate the molecular conception of the gene to the functional conception of the gene, then there is room for both conceptions. What I would argue,
Mhm.
though I don't know that Griffiths himself comes out and says as much, what I would argue is that there is no room for the nominal conception, except as the trivial historical accounting of whatever it is that people happen to do with the term.
Oh,
But
no, I completely disagree. I think he put that at the end of his paper for a reason. I think he ended up there. I think he ended up saying that the gene's whatever scientists say it is.
well, I don't disagree that it is whatever they say it is, provided that what they say is worth saying. But if you combine it with the rest of his conclusion, which is more than a single sentence, he's also telling us what it is that it is worth saying, namely that the molecular and functional conceptions both have their place depending on the area of biological inquiry one is interested in.
Oh, okay. Oh, is he being a bit didactic toward the scientists here then? Um,
Yes,
yeah. Okay. You're saying that he's sort of giving them lip service. It's whatever you guys say it is.
right.
But it's also this, read my paper.
It's quasi deferentialism. It's like, whatever you say, dear, but do what I
Uh-huh.
say.
You know what? I think I'd agree with that.
It's harder when you have a deer, but whatever. Okay, so
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's more real.
it gets more real. Yeah, exactly. Uh,
There's
so
actually
the
material out there.
oh baby. So the information in biology paper then is is where it gets difficult Because if there is function, then um, that will most likely be characterized in terms of information.
Mm-hmm.
But what information actually is complicated for a variety of reasons. And I'll lay out a few, and then and you can fill in. I'd like you to fill in whatever I missed. Uh,
Okay, yeah,
First of
you're the
all,
scaffolding builder, and I just come along and paint the picture.
you just paint the sideboard afterwards. Okay. Um, so the first problem is whether we mean it literally or metaphorically, right?
Yes,
Because
yes,
many
is the informational way of looking at biology, the genetic code, ultimately metaphorical?
right, right. If it is, then it cannot be said to be a great advance in biological sciences. At best, it's good for expository purposes, right?
Are you minimizing the use of metaphor?
Well, actually, I was just repeating the point made by Godfrey Smith. I mean, he says that to the extent that it is an advance in science, it needs to be literal. I mean, he's making a great assumption here, but I happen to share it. Let's just make it explicit between us that that scientific theory needs to be articulated in literal language.
Well, he has a wonderful line. Um, that I found this just the best, you know, best, most exquisite, somewhat humorous line in all three papers. He said something like, "We cannot expect biologists to be experts on the analysis of literal and non-literal language."
Yes, well, but even if they did not need to be, that is, even if others could take care of that, the question is whether it's scientific at all, if it's metaphor.
Did he ask that?
I think it's implied, or at least I take it to be implied by saying that it's not a scientific advance if it's not literal.
I think the beauty of this paper is he's bringing metaphor to science.
Well, science is suffused with metaphor, but it's just not an advance to the extent that it is. Like, take the example of the mechanistic conception of physics, where physics in the 17th century was analogized to the machines, the clockwork
Mm-hmm.
that was being made throughout Europe. Well,
Right.
that's a
Of course,
metaphor.
clocks were being developed in Switzerland at the time, to
Yes,
their highest point. Right.
and I mean, I don't know if it was only or if it was even centered in Switzerland. I'm not thinking of only timepieces, but also the automatons that were like uh, animated scenes that were sometimes attached to organs at the churches and also
Mm.
just
Mm.
made for entertainment purposes. But they used the same mechanism used in clocks, which is why clockwork was generally the way that kind of engineering was described. At
Hmm.
any rate, the point is that these were marvels of engineering innovations of the time, and it coincided with the work of Copernicus and Galileo and Descartes and all the rest. And it became an apparent metaphor that what was being suggested was that not only the planets move uh, in the sky according to mathematically precise description, but also that the bodies uh, here on the surface do so as well, and that at least here, if not in celestial mechanics, everything involved contact. So like pushing and pulling and
Mm-hmm.
and essentially local causation. This, of course, becomes an embarrassment to Newton's theory, which removes the the um, the celestial spheres and just has bodies moving in space in curves with no apparent pulling or pushing. Uh, to which his answer was, "Look, I don't know what's going on, or rather, I don't know why. I just know what. Please don't bother me."
Yeah.
So that's
Well, yeah, no, that's super interesting. Just the mechanics of movement, how informative it is on life
notice
itself.
notice how you speak. Notice how you speak. The mechanics, right? This is to say that movement is mechanical. This is to say that
Hmm.
movement accords with the metaphor of the machine.
Yeah. So what you're saying is movement could be more fundamental than say machines, right? I think
Mm,
one of these papers gives a definition of a machine, or
no, I'm
maybe
not saying that.
that's my other reading. Um,
I'm not saying that because I'm not saying that mechanical movement is redundant. There's movement, and then an additional concept is that of the machine. And when it was said at the time that movement is mechanical, what was being said was something metaphoric, namely that movement occurs in the manner of a machine, that is, in accordance with machines, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
that's
let me
not,
be clear. You have so one of the big criticisms of biology, and it's a helpful criticism, that John Dupre makes, is that it's relied so heavily on the metaphor of machines, and I
mhm,
think you're pushing back against that,
I am.
and you're basically saying, hey, machines is very is based on fundamental movement.
No,
It's not
no,
like
I'm
it's
not
some
saying that.
fancy 19th century thing. It's mechanical means movement.
No, I'm
That
not
seems to be
saying
what you're
that.
saying.
No, no, I'm not
Okay.
saying that at all. As I said just a moment ago, to say that movement is mechanical is not to repeat oneself. That's not redundant. Mechanical does not mean movement. It is movement in accordance with machines, metaphorically speaking. So, to the extent that a scientific theory depends on the metaphor of the machine, I agree with Dupre that it is a problem. But I disagree with him in another way. My disagreement with him is that I don't think it depends on the metaphor at all. The metaphor is only there to inspire us for the purposes of exposition, that is, to introduce beginners and to uh, guide our selection of hypotheses, which is basically what I had in mind by inspiration. But it does not stand in for theory, nor does it constrain it, at least not as a metaphor.
Oh yeah.
I
See,
don't think,
I would
uh,
disagree with that.
okay,
But
but
look,
just more, just more.
getting back to the paper, getting back to
Well,
the
no,
paper.
I'd like to finish. Um, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't an advance in science to think mechanistically. I just don't think that that
I wouldn't
advance,
argue with that. Yeah. No, I think it's been helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
but
I think Dupre just says,
I don't
is it
believe
now
I'm saying
limiting
that it's
us?
helpful. I don't believe that I'm saying it is helpful. I'm saying that it is an advance, which is a different thing. And I think that it was an advance not in virtue of its being a metaphor, but rather in virtue of it inspiring literal articulation of theory. The advance is in the literal theories that the metaphor inspired, not in the metaphor alone. That's
Is there
very
a
important
reason that you have this antagonism toward metaphor? Why do you want to separate the two?
because you can't mathematize metaphor. And
Oh,
and and and
okay.
and
All
and
right.
and and my
Yeah.
conception
I never
and
try
my
to. So,
yes, and my well,
and
maybe
you
you're
probably
not.
do.
Well, I'm not a scientist, so I don't do it either. But my point is that to do science, at least in the well, first of all, let's talk about what science is briefly. Um, I can think of two conceptions of science that are relevant to what we're talking about. One is the Aristotelian conception, and the other is the Galilean or Galilean Baconian Cartesian conception. You can take them all together, but I happen to think Galileo is the most central of the three.
Mm,
The Aristotelian conception, first of all, the word science is just Latin for theoretical knowledge, roughly. I don't
hmm.
know exactly beyond
Why do you
that
say theoretical knowledge versus just knowledge?
well, because there are other forms of knowledge that are not scientific, and the word science in Latin picked out that particular kind, as
Oh,
far as I know.
okay. So you do agree that there are other forms of knowledge than science knowledge,
I wouldn't say that they are forms, but
or other
rather,
kinds of knowledge
let's
that are
just say
not.
that there are other means by which to arrive at knowledge.
Great.
For instance,
So can I put that down as a future podcast?
absolutely. Let me write that down.
Yeah, this is something I've asked a lot of people about.
There's two different questions here, actually, which is how to understand the Latin and Greek, and second, about knowledge per se.
Hmm.
Uh,
Okay. Philology
Ironically,
and
well, no, I don't want to say philology.
or just linguistics,
it's just translation. It's just trying to figure out what they were talking about.
just
Um,
language. Mm-hmm.
Specifically, translation of what they were talking about. Uh, because well, first of all, science isn't even Greek, right? It's Latin. The only reason I'm using the Latin is because, for historical reasons, much of Aristotelian thought is done in Latin, although he wrote it all in Greek, because uh, though there was only one Aristotle, there were 2,000 years worth of Aristotelians
Mm-hmm.
centered on the church, and I think science got got its currency from that particular tradition. But in the Greek, I'm not really sure what science would translate into. My guess is episteme, but I'm not sure. So for Aristotle, science is roughly speaking theoretical knowledge, and it is inclusive for the Aristotelians right up to the Renaissance, right up to Descartes, Galileo, and Bacon. It is inclusive of theology, mathematics, and and perhaps any number of other knowledge disciplines that we wouldn't ordinarily call science today. Today, we've become so hard-nosed about it that many don't even want to include sociology, politics, economics, or sociology, or at the very least, we call them soft. I don't know that Aristotle would really understand why we do so. And I think the reason is because our conception of science today is given more by those Renaissance figures. So I want to highlight the contributions of each three so that I can make a point of why it's important to use literal language. From Galileo, we have the idea that whatever theories we say to be true, that is, whatever it is that we are proposing as to be considered scientific knowledge, ought to be mathematized. That is, it ought to be couched the in the grammar and and structure of mathematics, using predicates that aren't themselves mathematical, but no sentential structures beyond what is given by math. That's not going to gel well with metaphor. For Descartes, we want to focus on the clear and distinct ideas, to use his phrase, and I don't see much clarity or distinctiveness in metaphorical language, as beautiful and useful as it may be. And for Bacon, it's most obvious, I think, because he explicitly calls out avoiding miscommunication, misunderstandings due to language, and biases due to personal experiences or backgrounds. These are the idols uh, that are the sources of error, idols of the cave and idols of the marketplace. So this is the new scientific tradition. This is what we think of as science today and have for a few hundred years, if not all the way back to antiquity. And as such, there's no place for metaphor in it. Now, I spoke too soon. There is a place for metaphor, but again, it's at best to inspire us, to be creative in the context of uh, discovery as opposed to the context of justification, to use the Popperian distinction. I think that's Poppers, I'm not really sure. And also for exposition. You know, when Brian Greene does his YouTube videos about physics, he's going to employ metaphor, but that in no way implicates the work of the string theorists themselves.
Oh
So
God,
that's my
Brian
case
Greene.
against metaphor.
Okay, no, thank you. It was, that was good. It was very clear, and I do understand. Um, I I do understand the urge of all three to mathematize it, to be clear, and what was Bacon's?
To avoid misunderstandings
Avoid misunderstanding. Okay,
due
yeah,
to
that,
bias and
yeah,
vagaries of
I get
language.
that. I mean, even with philosophy, I think that's the case.
Well, I
Um,
mean, it's not for nothing that philosophy has 100 years ago been rebooted as scientific philosophy. I mean, I think what they had in mind was to make it more mathematical and more uh, strict, at least in its ambitions regarding its articulation and language.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, I totally get that. I don't think I'm going to make my big counter argument today. Um, because it would just take, it would take some time. Um, but here's what I'd say in relation to what our show so far. We've seen the import. Well, Sometimes the only way to get to the material is through metaphor.
Like when?
Well, let's jump right into the Godfrey Smith paper. Okay. He presents two kinds of theories of information. You can talk about causation and correlation. First fire and then smoke. There's a metaphor.
No, it's not. That's an
Metaphors
example.
used all the time
No, that's not a metaphor. That's an example.
that's a metaphor for
Well,
information.
okay. We'll just build up the kindle for the fire that we'll light when we discuss metaphor on a future date. But much of what you'll call metaphor, I'll reconceptualize in different ways. But I certainly agree that some who speak of information speak metaphorically. I'll give you an example. When Dawkins says that genes are selfish, that's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Genes are not literally selfish.
Yeah. Biggest book of, the last 50 years in biology. A metaphor. So,
Well,
but
no,
okay,
no, no,
but
no.
getting into
His
this paper,
theory.
is you've got your causal connection between the informational domain and the ordinary physical domain, right? That's
No.
that's the big point about causation, is there's some kind of literal connection between the informational domain and the physical domain. Do physical objects share their informational property? Is information a separate stuff? Okay, there's a metaphor. Is information a separate stuff? And then he goes into, do we need a richer idea of information, such as semantic or intentional? Okay, and I think that's where the metaphor comes out. So with the genome, can we impute a semantic theory into biology? That of the sign and the signified. Did information itself with biology go semantic? Of course it did in our minds with language, but did it in our biology?
What was the last bit again? Did it go? Did it
Did
go?
it go did the information go semantic in biology? Right? Okay, you could say genes tend
No,
to
no,
be
but you said it did in our minds. Of course, you said.
yeah.
How so?
Well, I think we've used several metaphors today.
Look,
For instance, with the English language, I do think, there's a semantic and metaphorical aspect.
but how's that biology?
Well, okay, so now that's the question. Did information in biology, such as genetic information, is there a semantic relationship? Okay. And he says genes tend to be literalists, which I'm sure you like that, especially
You mean
when they are
geneticists, not
especially
genes?
when they're coding proteins. But are they literalists? What about
I'm sorry.
methylation
I'm
and
sorry. Are you?
cross-gene interaction?
Well,
That
hold
sounds a
on.
bit semantic.
Hold on. Let's go a little slower. You're piling it on, and I'm not taking notes. Are you asking whether genes themselves are literalist?
Mm-hmm.
That
Well,
itself
I
is
don't
not.
ask it. He asks it.
I don't think he does. Maybe you can point me to where he does. I think he's talking about geneticists, not the
I
genes.
don't have a page. I don't have a page here. No, when he's talking information, he's talking about AGC and T. He's not talking about geneticists information.
I understand that, but what you said just now earlier was about being a literalist, not about being information. Those are two distinct questions. I think he is asking whether the genes are whether there is information in the genes, whether we can speak of informational properties or relations relating the genes to each other and to the phenotype. But he's not asking whether the genes are literalists.
Well, okay, I'm looking in the paper. I've found one line. Genes carry a message.
Tell me where.
Oh, sorry. 107
Mm-hmm.
in the third paragraph, towards
Okay.
the end. You there?
Mm-hmm.
Genes carry a message that is supposed, this is in italics, that is supposed to be expressed. That would be the literal, whether or not it is actually expressed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Once we take the alleged semantic properties of genes as seriously as this, some new questions arise. Yeah. So look, I'm not going to just read this, but that's one area. And it seems to me this is the big the two major points of this paper, and the question of the paper is information only causal, or does biological information have a semantic aspect?
Oh, that's correct. You didn't use the word literal, so I suppose this wasn't really about. One second. This wasn't about whether genes are literalists. Are you there?
Yeah, yeah, I'm here. Um, somehow I came up with that. I don't know if he uses. I thought he used the term literalist. I can go back and read this.
Okay, I wanted to press on that, but we don't have to. We can postpone that to the question of what is a metaphor, and then come back to this and relate it, because I think we're going to disagree about the nature of metaphor much more than about the nature of genes and information. So I think we ought
Yeah,
to
I
focus
think you're
on
right. Yeah.
what remains of his argument, independent of the question of metaphor for now. And I like the way you put it. Uh, that is, if if we assume that if we assume that that there is genetic information in the Shannon sense, that is, in the sense of correlation and causation between
Causation.
pairs of systems, such that the traits or the properties of the one is indicative of the properties of the other, then we can say that there's an informational relation there that falls short of anything semantic. And then we can go on to
Hmm.
ask whether additionally there's something we may want to call semantic information, where the mark of the semantic aspect to that information is the capacity for error, truth, uh, and normativity, which is what he's characterizing here as suppositions, where he says supposed in italics. There would be
Mm.
nothing that it is supposed to be if there were only a correlation or a causal relation between the informed
Oh, I see.
and
That's what
the
you're saying. He
informer.
means by supposed. Yeah, but even the causal question's very interesting.
Oh,
You
okay.
know,
Hold on a second.
I mean, before you even get onto the
Uh,
semantic thing, it's suppose is proposing that
okay.
genes are context somehow kind of context independent. The genes are a special kind of cause. And the example he uses is, he says a gay gene, I think this is from Shannon, a gay gene, by the way, we found no such thing. A gay gene is an instruction to be gay, even when, because of other factors, the person is straight. Right. That's the causal direction.
Let's set aside the question of metaphor, since I think we know, or rather, we agree more. You and I agree more on these biological concepts, the concept of gene, and also the broader concept of information, or at least to the extent that it is elaborated here by Godfrey Smith, more than we do about metaphor. So let's
Right.
set that,
We got to do that in an ongoing way.
or even just dedicate a session or two to it.
Hmm.
But so let's set that aside. And for now, just contemplate that what's being asked here is, on the assumption that it is easily established that that there are pairs of systems. On the one hand, the environment, and on the other hand, the organism. To take a simple example, pairs of systems, the other one being the gene to the phenotype, pairs of systems that are informative of each other in virtue of being correlated, and there being causal relations between them. Even given that, there is an additional question as to whether these relations are semantic, where by semantic we mean something normative, something that admits of the possibility of error, the possibility of truth, and maybe even representation. And uh, and that's characterized by that very quote that you offered earlier, namely that genes may carry a message that is supposed to be expressed. The supposition makes it normative. We would not say of a pair of systems merely that because one is causally correlated with the other, that there are suppositions of any kind.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you're proposing the whole great passive idea of causation. And of course, genes were thought to be the most passive back when they were thought to be the most material.
What do you mean by a passive conception of causation? And I'm not sure that I do have that conception.
Um, so the example that he uses is a gay gene, which we have not found one, is an instruction to be gay, even when, because of other factors, the person is straight. Right. This is his example of the literal, okay, you don't want me to use literal, the causal idea of information. It's a kind of passive, um, it was a view of genes back in the middle of the last century. The genes just passively passed on their information and
Oh, oh,
created proteins, right? And then we found out later, no, 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 the environment could turn them on and off. There's the whole interaction with other genes. There's just a lot of interaction going on there. It's not just some passive information thing. And this
yeah,
brings up the question of semantics or intentionality.
I see. Oh, okay. I still don't know exactly what you mean, but Godfrey Smith does talk about passivity of of the genes as being suggestive of the semantic of semantic properties because they resemble the paradigmatic cases of semantic properties, namely that of words in a book. Words in a book are not actively causal upon their readers. It is
Mhm.
instead the readers that are active in relation to the book and then are informed uh, or inform themselves, that is, readers inform themselves by way of the book, though the book is passively seen. And so similarly, the mechanisms of the cell will read off the sequences within the nucleus, but the DNA is not catalyzing anything.
Well, first of all, I like your metaphor. And it seems that
It's
what you're
not
trying
it's not a
reading a book. Yeah,
it's
but
not a
it seems
metaphor, it's a paradigm example. The point being that because uh, reading of words is not literally happening in the nucleus with the DNA, we can at best say that there is an analogy to semantics, but it isn't then established that there is any semantics. It's just suggestive. We still need to give an account for why we should say that there is any semantic information in the chromosomes in virtue of their being passive. But this is contrary to what you were suggesting, because you were saying that I don't know why, that I have a passive conception of causation. First of all, what's passive here is not the causation, but rather the um, the the causes. That is the DNA, right? So
the
in like,
causes are passive.
well, okay. Basically, the idea is if the DNA is causal and it's passive, it is causal in virtue of its structure, the sequence, and not because the molecules impart by way of catalysis or the transmission of energy, the efficiency of the effects. Instead, that all comes from the extranuclear activity, such as
That
mRNAs going
oh,
in and out.
that was super complex. But I would love to drill into it.
Okay.
What did you mean by the nuclear? And then you use some fancy term.
Okay. So how does the DNA have an effect on the rest of the body, on the phenotype? It is because mRNA is uh, is reading off sequences in the DNA, or rather, something, I don't know what exactly, something is reading off the sequences in the DNA, creating mRNA, which then passes outside the nuclear membrane to the ribosomes, ultimately resulting in proteins that ultimately have catalytic properties that then, together with the energy that comes in by ATP or whatever else makes everything move. And when we speak of causal, when we speak of causal relations, we are, at least when uh, considering specifically what we might call efficient causation, we're talking about what makes things happen. This is where the momentum comes from, basically, what kicks it off, the initial conditions, the the source of the dynamics, whatever it is that accounts for it not being merely static. What makes
Stat,
the book
do you mean
educate
static or
you?
passive?
Static.
You mean
What
static.
makes
Okay. You do mean
what
static.
Yeah, what because the information is static. You see, the information in the shallow sense, not in the semantic sense, is merely um, the sequences being what they are as opposed to something else and being in correlation with something else, namely the phenotype and or the environment. It's like a
Well,
book. A
there
book
certainly are regulatory mechanisms which try to keep us static, right?
that's a different that's a different issue. What I mean to say is that the energy that moves the body does not come from the nucleus of the cell. It's like a book. A book doesn't educate you. You educate yourself by studying using the book.
Right, right. No, and I think the cool thing that you're getting at is it's um well, okay, you're talking about a kind of translation, and
Mm.
and so I think we're asking what levels of translation happens from the information. Um, but I am totally open to Godfrey Smith's idea that there could be some semantic steps going on.
Uh, oh, I insist on it. I think he's absolutely right. Maybe we haven't gotten around to the thesis. Let's just state it. The thesis is that information can be understood in two ways: one shallow, one deep, or as he puts it, one minimal and the other one rich. The minimal
Hmm.
one is purely causation and correlation. You introduced this earlier, but I'm just
Hmm.
reviewing.
Hmm.
And the second one also involves normativity, truth, error, uh, and 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 is mostly known by its paradigm case, namely what occurs in mind, beliefs, words on the page, and the like. The question is whether there exists information in that richer sense, which again is known of paradigmatically in the context of speech and mental states. The question is whether information in that richer sense also occurs in biological, the microbiological phenomena, such as the genes and also hormones as signals. Whether they can be said to be well, I don't want to say communicating, although I think that would be appropriate, but I don't want to introduce concepts that weren't in the Godfrey Smith. Uh, whether they can be said to be true or false, whether they can be said to be uh, functionally correct or incorrect on occasion, and whether they can be said to be more than merely causal and causal correlates that indicate one another. And he argues that there are developments in both theoretical biology and the philosophy of biology, of which he is a major contributor. He cites himself several times to give accounts for the for a kind of naturalized teleology, what he calls teleofunctionalism, that 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 explains what this additional richness is, what additional ingredient there is, such that we might say that information isn't merely a correlation of one with the other. So, for example, if it's dark outside, that is informative of being on the far side from the sun, because it is the side nearer to the sun that is lit. In other words, it is now night. But being dark is not semantically informative. It isn't something that can be true or false. It isn't anything like the paradigm case of a mental state or a written sentence. But that's because being dark is a causal consequence of the light coming from the sun. That is, it's an active causal relation that that brings it about that it being dark is indicative of being on the far side from the sun. There's nothing arbitrary about that relationship. On the other
Um,
hand,
yeah.
the relationship between genes and their traits uh, does seem arbitrary because of the genetic codes relation between specific codons and specific amino acids, resembling something like the uh, presumably arbitrary alphabet on the basis of which we communicate in English. And what Godfrey Smith points out is that it only looks arbitrary because of the contingency of the molecules of tRNA by which that translation occurs, but that in fact it may not be arbitrary at all. And additionally, even if it can be said that there is some kind of semantic connection between the genes and the immediate causal consequences, that is the generation uh, of the proteins, it doesn't follow that then there's a semantic relation between the genes and phenotypic traits at the macro scale, much less the environment. So that's that's what he's asking and commenting on.
And it's a good question. It's a good question. Tonight's the opening of the Olympics, so I'm going to perform an Olympic feat here and ask, what if we tie this into the third paper
Oh, well, the tie-in
and
is
relate
very direct.
semantic to natural selection?
Yes, absolutely. The connection is very direct, and here it is. Well, first of all, the third paper is asking on it basically examines the description of natural selection. We have the Darwinian one. We have one from various other 20th century biologists like Mayer, Maynard Smith, etc. And we find in those descriptions that there is an implicit um, hypothesized entity which has come to be known as the unit of selection. Roughly speaking, that which evolves. But on closer inspection, that which evolves uh, can be a number of different things depending on what aspect of the natural selection process we're talking about. Are we
Hmm.
talking about the part that gets copied, the part that gets selected for, or um, or I forget what was the third one. There was a third one.
Oh, this was back with replicators and implicators and
Oh, the
uh,
interactors. There's the
arresters,
replicator. There's the replicator, the interactor.
fornicator.
Well, actually, yes, right. But only in sexual selection. Oh, by the way, one of the comments on the previous podcast that I received from friends is that we speak to sexual selection. We already brought in the gay gene. In fact, I think we should make it a point that every single podcast mention being gay,
The
just for
gauge.
fun.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be for you. We'll have to come up with one for me, something that has to be mentioned every single time. It could be my obsession with metaphor. I don't know. That's not personal enough, but we'll figure out something. At any rate, yeah, we should talk about sexual selection, but let's hold on that because it's pretty complicated. The main thing here
Let's
is
do
that
sexual selection in another paper,
yeah,
because
for
I
sure.
would love to bring in the idea of beauty there. Um,
Oh, really?
Beauty's rarely talked about in philosophy. Of course,
You're
there are
right.
those who do it, Roger Scruton, so forth.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I think beauty is an interesting concept in sexual selection.
Oh, I'm so glad you said so because in preparation for this, I did some thinking about sexual selection, and mostly the conclusion I came to was that there was precious little of philosophical interest about sexual selection that could not be said to be interesting about natural selection generally. That is, there wasn't anything so special about sex in the context of natural selection that merited philosophical attention, with one exception, and that is beauty. It occurred to me that
Hmm.
that
Oh, wow.
yeah, that sexual selection um, is evidently, although not obviously why, but is evidently sensitive to beauty. And I'm thinking here not so much about human beauty and natural selection, but something more like the peacock's tail, which
Yeah.
is not beautiful only to the cock, but also to us, which is why we take those feathers and decorate with them. So we
Oh, I
should not
like that.
confuse. We
You're
should not
looking for a kind
confuse.
of universal
Oh, absolutely. We
aspect.
should not confuse beauty with sexual attraction because we're not sexually attracted to the feathers of the peacock. You know,
Hmm.
the appreciation of beauty by the hen is no different from our appreciation of the peacock's feathers, or at least that's something that I want to speculate on. Now, what beauty is, as you've said, is almost ignored, at least for the last 150 years. That is not since German idealism, I think, does it get much attention. And even Scruton, I wouldn't qualify as much of an exception because he's mostly just expanding on the contributions made to the philosophy of
On
beauty
the yeah, the
in
Schopenhauer
German,
continental. Yeah.
well, more Kant, but yeah, he's basically
Okay.
expanding on the Kantian
Well,
reflections on beauty.
Kant, that's the core of continental. We're talking
I don't want
reductively here,
I
right?
don't want to dispute that. I don't think that's true, but I don't want to dispute it.
Oh,
But
you
I
don't
think
think
what
it's true? Okay.
no, but I think what we can agree on is that Scruton's reflections on beauty are largely Kantian.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay.
Okay,
Um,
and
so
that
so
this
I,
is
I'm
why
I'm
and and
feeling like
and
we owe Elizabeth Lloyd at least a couple lines about her paper. You and I had a conversation ourselves about it. Um,
yes.
but her main thing is she pushes back against Dawkins
Well, let
with
me
the
just
selfish gene, which you mentioned earlier.
yeah, let me just articulate. So what she says basically is there's various different things that can be said to be the units of selection, and various ways of of and these are the gene, the organism, a population of organisms, the lineage as a whole, maybe the species as a whole. Um, these are alternative uh, um, replicators, alternative interactors, and so on.
Before you get into all that, just the
Mhm.
fundamental question, just for our audience to understand, what is the basic unit of selection? Where does natural selection work at?
Mhm.
Right. So,
Mhm.
so that's what we're getting into. Is it the gene, like Richard Dawkins says, or could it also be a population of
Right.
individuals? Could it be a
And
group
and
of individuals that's driving the natural selection?
right.
Yeah.
And
So,
and the second question she's asking is, apart from what level is the appropriate level of analysis for selection, what is a unit of selection uh, functionally in the first place? Is it that which is copied? Is it that which is selected for? Or
mm,
is it that which manifests the trait that is selected for? I think those were the three, or at least three of the maybe four or five uh, disambiguated senses of unit of selection. And what she proposes basically is that various controversies in the biology of natural selection can be resolved by pointing out that uh, there is a failure to make these distinctions, and that in certain phenomena, what is appropriate is to say that whereas the replicator may be the gene, the 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 unit that gets actually selected might be the trait that is determined by the gene. Here now, assuming at least some measure of genetic determinism. We should talk about genetic determinism because that's something that Godfrey Smith talks about as well, and I bet you have plenty to say about that as well.
you
But
mean
before we,
now? You mean now?
no, let's
Or
save it for a
some
moment.
at some point? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, look, we've gone on 2 hours.
Oh,
That's my
very briefly, let me just say a little more.
maximum.
Let me just say a little more. So Dawkins' idea then is that the proper unit of selection in both respects, that is, uh, what are all the different roles being played by this unit in the logic of natural selection, but also um, what is the unit is in every case the gene. And this was articulated in the selfish gene, but also reinforced by his other works. And the criticism of Dawkins um, is that this is overly simplistic. Now, it seems to me, in light of the other papers that we read, that Dawkins can be defended by a defense of genetic determinism or some moderated version of genetic determinism that takes proper account of the relation between the genes in their causal contributions, uh, whether it be by semantics or mere causal relations with respect to the two different kinds of information and the
Oh,
environment.
interesting. Okay.
Okay,
Hmm.
so that's my overall thesis for how to connect all these papers, and we can elaborate that on further discussions later. But basically, just to say it again, you can defend the genic conception of selection, that is Dawkins' conception of natural selection as centered exclusively at the gene, on the basis of a defense of some moderated version of genetic determinism that itself depends on a semantic conception of information that itself relates the genes to traits um, and the phenotype, more broadly speaking, and I would say even the environment, which is something that not even Godfrey Smith wants to say.
So
Although
you're
he does
open
cite
to
people who do argue for this.
you're open to semantic happenings
Oh, no, no, I insist on
here,
it.
and
I insist on it.
yeah, and so you think it's natural selection. You remember when you and I have talked about natural selection, that I bring up the idea that selection itself is a metaphor. Now you say that it doesn't have to be,
I think it's
um,
not.
uh, but uh, I, I think it's super interesting. Yeah, reading Elizabeth Lloyd after reading these other couple of papers,
Yeah.
particularly the information paper, because there's a whole there's a whole bit of teleology going on
Yes.
with
That's
natural
right.
selection.
Yes.
Okay, and there's a bit of teleology. So one of the metaphors we always use with DNA is that it's coding, right? And
Hmm.
we think of computer coding
Right.
being similar to computer programming. And this notion, this metaphor, I think, suffers from the worst kind of teleology.
Hmm. I agree.
Um,
I agree.
but it's just the whole question there. There is a richness. There is a richness in there to comparing the code of biology to computer code. Is there a is there information in all matter that's
Right.
related? That's related.
Yeah, no, these are the right follow-up questions. All right. Well, to your point of reaching our maximum, I think what we've done is open maybe 10 different threads, not including the ones I wrote down as topics of interest going forward. Mostly the ones that I wrote down were the ones that were not immediately related to philosophy of biology. But even if we focus just on the ones that follow on from what we've discussed so far, I think any one of them could be the focus of a couple of hours conversation based on additional reading. So we'll figure out what it is that we're interested in discussing offline, and then take it from there. But I think I just want to leave you and the audience, the two or three people who made it this far in, uh, with the how radical the thesis that I want to defend really is. I
We
want to
want to. I
defend.
want to make a shout out for those two or three people.
I'm on. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, the I want to defend that it is semantic, that it isn't semantic only at the first level, but all the way up to the phenotype and the environment, and that it is teleological, not teleological in the Aristotelian sense, that is, as some kind of primary form of causation, but rather in a naturalizable sense, that is mechanistically reducible. So I think I want to defend all of that in non-metaphorical terms. What I would not defend, though, is the computer metaphor, not because it's false, but because it's a metaphor. So it's instructive as far as it goes, uh, but 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 doesn't go far enough. Mainly because it's an artifact. Computers are artifacts. They get their intentionality from the engineer, but biology does not get its intentionality, or its functionality, rather, sorry, from any engineer or designer. And one last
That's a great way to say it. Yeah.
super important, and the last bit is that 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 no, I think I'll have to leave it there. I forgot.
All right, I threw you off. Okay, so let me give just a final thought too. You mentioned mechanistically reducible. Um,
No, because that's a metaphor, and reductions have to be literal. So it's just reducible
oh, it's just
to
well, you said
Okay, well,
mechanisms of
what I
reducible.
meant is
But
reducible
okay,
to
but you
molecular
mean reducible.
biology.
So
Well,
this
no,
is
I mean
why.
you have to say what it's reducible to, otherwise you haven't said anything. I want to say it's reducible
Uh,
to molecular biology, to the chemistry, basically.
oh, okay, all right. And my final thought on this is all three papers, and probably the next three we would read. Well, actually, the next one in the book is on this. All three papers are basically talking about reductionism.
As well as other topics, but yes.
That's it.
Excellent. Okay. Until next time.
All right. Okay, let's see. Where's the